Last week it was the debate over Islamophobia that split the Canadian Parliament. This week it's more division over the security of the Canadian border as asylum seekers walk into Canada illegally. What's happening and what does it really mean? Chantel's in Montreal, Andrew is here in Toronto, and Althea joins us this week from Ottawa. All right, well, these issues aren't really the same, but there is a kind of a common thread to them. Why is this stuff so contentious right now and in the Parliament of Canada? Andrew.
Well, you start with a legitimate concern, which is Islamist terrorism. That's a real phenomenon. It's a real danger to this country. But a certain section of opinion has taken that and run with it to extend to what they would call a critique of Islam, which as often as not degenerates into wild statements about Muslims in general, and even as a critique of Islam, usually caricatures, or you cherry pick some crazy imam somewhere in the world and then you make that stand for Islam. And while that's been a factor for some time in our debates, you now have a conservative leadership race going on in which a certain section of the number of the leadership candidates are paying court to that slice of opinion within the party. Add to that this motion that was in front of the Parliament, a similar motion, of course, the Conservatives had happily signed on for back in October, I think it was, of last year. But now with the leadership race on, suddenly it became this unbearable assault on free speech, et cetera, which is simply factually untrue. There is no doubt there are people out there who would like to restrict speech on, particularly in this matter, to do with Islam, and that's to be guarded against, and I would oppose it. But this motion, which is all it is, does not restrict anybody's speech.
Chantel?
There is no doubt that there are also people out there who have a fear or prejudice of Muslims and who are not terribly into immigration, and there is increasingly no doubt that they are overrepresented within the voting membership of the Conservative Party. And that some candidates, at least, are catering to that section of the party in the hope of winning the leadership. I think if you took away the Conservative leadership campaign, we wouldn't have been having this incredibly strange debate about a motion in the House of Commons. Like motions in parliaments in Canada, there are a dime a dozen. They come from private members. They range from the National Assembly not liking the New York Times or the Washington Post to Mother's Day statements. They do not have any legislative impact, and they put no obligation on the government. This week we saw former cabinet ministers from the Harper era entertain the notion that this was a threat to free speech. Only leadership politics of the worst kind can account for that.
Althea, you're watching a lot of this close up, both on the leadership campaign trail, but also right there in the House of Commons. Is that read that Chantel's giving us that there's a lot of leadership politics at stake here?
I agree with that partly. I'm not actually convinced that if there was no leadership race happening, that the Conservatives would have changed their behavior on this motion, which is M103, which is, as everybody else has said, a non-binding motion that does not change our hate laws in this country or affect your charter rights. Because if you look back in the fall, actually, when the Parliament was asked for unanimous consent on a similar motion condemning Islamophobia, a handful of Conservative MPs actually yelled out no. And this was unprompted and unplanned. But the fact that the leadership's office, the interim leader, Rona Ambrose, has not, perhaps communicated effectively to caucus as to, and I know this, some Conservative MPs are very upset with this, she has not laid out perhaps a reasoning for why the Conservative Party has decided to not support this motion, or given very good example. Basically, the Conservatives got outmaneuvered by the Liberals. This is crass politics completely. The Liberals are trying to squeeze the Conservatives and portray them as a racist party, and the Conservatives got outplayed.
Andrew, is there danger for the Liberals in playing this game and trying to push the Conservatives down the racist track?
Well, in danger for the country. There's no doubt that most of the fault here is on the Conservative side for taking the bait on this private member's motion. And having disgraced themselves on that, some of the more moderate members of the party were looking for a bridge to sort of get back to normalcy on this, and they provided a compromise motion which is functionally, essentially identical to the original motion. If the Liberals were interested in making peace out of this, having made their point about the Conservatives, let's say, they could have then passed that motion. Instead, they voted against it. So both sides are playing politics, but I don't want to say that they're equivalent either.
Go ahead, Chantel.
To set up a trap, you have to find people who are dumb enough to walk into it.
That's right.
And why it sticks to the Conservatives, the federal Conservatives, and will stick to them, is that at the same time, some of their fellow travelers at Queen's Park, for instance, have absolutely no problem endorsing the same kind of resolution. So in the end, you're left with a rationale that basically says a party that repeatedly backs motions on anti-Semitism, for instance, and never tells you that means you can't criticize the state of Israel, is now trying to bridge that impossible ford and to say this is where this is going to. The danger to the country that Andrew is referring to is that one of Canada's strengths in the immigration debate, as opposed to other places, is that we have not had a party that has catered to fears about immigrants in the past. And the Liberals are pushing the Conservatives down that road for partisan gain, but in the end, everybody will lose.
Exactly.
All right, let me just move it quickly to the security of the border issue, because another Conservative, Tony Clement, got kind of caught on this one in an interview with CBC Radio in Montreal this week, and the interviewer was pressing hard to try and get the Conservative position on what they would do with these people who are walking across the border. Let me show you what happened.
The RCMP are there on the border. What would you like them to do differently?
I would like the government to come up with a plan to apply the law.
And my question is, what would that? Yeah, what would that mean? Well, I'm just curious to know what happens to those people who are crossing on foot when they meet the police.
I'm not the government. The CBC is not the government. It's up to the government.
But with respect, you're the official opposition, and you're supposed to be coming up with solutions as well as just criticizing.
Come up with a plan.
But what? So you don't have any idea how it should work?
Sir, now you're putting words in my mouth.
Well, then tell us what. Then tell us how it should work.
Sir,
I mean, it's a simple question.
We have a problem. It's simple. Apply the law.
Well, how would they apply the law? So would they stop them? Would they say, "I'm sorry, you can't cross here, and you should go back across the border"? How would?
So Mike Finnerty, the CBC Montreal host, gets the dial tone. And, in his defense, he just kept asking the same question over and over again, which is the way you can pursue these kind of interviews, but there was no answer forthcoming. Althea, you've had a chance to talk to Tony Clement. What happened there? Because it seems to underline the problem they've got on these two issues.
Well, I spoke to Mr. Clement today, and actually we're launching a podcast next week on HuffPost. It's called Follow Up. And he left the interview because he didn't like the question I was asking him. And then he came back and said, "I'm not hanging up." And he took the microphone and he said, "I'm not hanging up, I'm not hanging up." Basically, he didn't have an answer because the government is following the law. Perhaps there are things that he could have suggested. Maybe he wants to suggest that the government change the law so that we detain new arrivals for a longer period of time. Right now, basically, they're arrested and they're let go if they, are not a danger to the public or their identity can't be verified. Or we have concern that they're not going to show up at a hearing. In those cases, we can detain them. Maybe there could be a suggestion that we change the law so we detain them right away. I don't know. But instead of offering some suggestions, he just kept saying the government should obey the law. Well, the government is obeying the law, and I think he just got frustrated because he didn't have anything else to say.
Chantal, how'd you see it?
Well, because it's hard for the Conservatives to argue this. You should detain people for whatever amount of time they may have in mind when you're watching little kids and toddlers and babies crossing that border. The Conservatives obviously do not want to ask Trudeau to suspend the agreement that treats the United States as a safe haven, meaning if you show up at a proper border point from the U.S., you're going to be turned back because you are in a safe country. The Conservatives don't want to go down that road. For sure, nobody has come up with an answer, and for sure, when the weather gets warmer, as those anti-illegal immigrant statutes that President Trump has in mind come into force, there will be more people coming to the border, and some semblance of a solution will have to be found.
Andrew, help us wrap this discussion up, because both these issues have made headlines for a week. They could be, 1 week wonders in our business, or they could be one of those issues that defines a party for some time in the future. Where are we on those two on this?
Well, there's legitimate concerns in both cases. In one case, Islamist terrorism. In this case, you're talking about the rising numbers of people arriving illegally. The Conservatives have a checkered history on this. They made great strides under Stephen Harper in terms of reaching out to immigrant communities, particularly under Jason Kenney's tenure at Citizenship. And then they also made some missteps, things like the niqab ban, et cetera, that did not play well and shouldn't have played well, not only with immigrant communities, but I think with the broader population. There's no doubt, however, that there is a section of public opinion out there that, depending on how you press that nerve ending, will respond. We've seen this over and over, not just with the Conservatives, but with the PQ in Quebec, with the McGuinty government in Ontario. Sometimes it can work for you, discreditably, I would say, but sometimes it works. But sometimes, if you play it wrong, it can really backfire. And the Conservatives have to be very conscious, just from a narrow partisan sense, that they could do themselves a lot of damage on this file in pursuit of short-term gain or in pursuit of satiating this one section of their base. To my mind, the only candidate, and this is not an endorsement because there's lots more issues to be decided in this, but the only candidate among the leaderships who's spoken out forcefully on this is Michael Chong. And I would say a lot of other leading members of the party need to start speaking out in this, need to start saying we cannot go down this road as a party.
All right, going to leave it at that for this week. Althea, thanks for joining us. Andrew here in Toronto, Chantal in Montreal.